Picture this: the greatest king in the world, the man who commanded the largest empire anyone had ever seen, doesn't fear enemy soldiers or rebel cities, or even the mighty Greek armies. No. What truly haunted King Xerxes of Persia were the whispers and jealous glances inside his own palace walls. And here's the part that'll make you sit up: the deadliest battles of Xerxes. Life weren't fought on the battlefield, they were fought in his own bedroom. The precious harem of the Persian Empire, filled with his wives, concubines, and lovers, was more dangerous than any army of Sparta or Athens. Now imagine golden halls filled with laughter one moment, and silent tears the next. Imagine perfumes, silk curtains, and jewels on one side, while behind them lurked knives, betrayal, and the blood-red shadows of sexual jealousy. One queen, known for her beauty and her terrifying rage, would stop at nothing to destroy any woman she thought had stolen her husband's heart. That queen's name was Amestris. And if you've never heard of her, oh, you're about to. Because her story is a nightmare from the history books, a warning of just how dangerous love, lust, and sexual rivalry can become inside a throne room. In the next few minutes, you're going to hear how Xerxes, the most powerful man alive, nearly lost everything, not because of enemy swords, but because of the furious battles sparked by his own passion. You'll learn about queens tearing each other apart, concubines caught in a deadly game, and the shocking sexual scandal that pushed Amestris over the edge. This is ancient history, yes, but don't let the word ancient fool you. These people loved, hated, fought, and feared in ways that feel as raw and real as anything you've seen in your own life. The palace was a battlefield of its own, and sometimes the wounds cut even deeper than war. By the end of this story, you may look at Xerxes not as a mighty empire builder, but as a man trapped in a golden cage haunted by the women he loved, and destroyed by the rivalries he couldn't control. So take a deep breath, because we're about to walk into the royal chambers of Xerxes himself. And trust me, once you step inside, you'll realize the scariest place in Persia wasn't the battlefield. It was the king's bed. Now that you know Xerxes wasn't only haunted by armies, but by the women closest to him, let's actually step inside the most secretive place of all, his harem. First, forget the idea of a harem being just a row of pretty faces. This was no quiet lounge filled with women waiting to be admired. The harem of the Persian king was a world of its own, almost like a small kingdom hidden inside the palace. Behind those golden doors were dozens, even hundreds of women. Highborn wives, young princesses taken from across the empire, foreign concubines given as gifts, and hand-picked attendants who lived only to please the great king. On the surface, it sparkled. Imagine courtyards shaded with vines, fountains of cool water, and carpets so soft your feet sank into them. The women wore silks and gold bracelets. Their hair smelled of oils, and their eyes glittered with kohl. But beneath the perfumes and jewels, there was tension in the air sharp as a drawn blade. Every woman knew the truth. Only one thing mattered here: Xerxes' attention. His glance could raise you from a shadow to a star. His love, or even just his desire, could give you wealth, influence, and power beyond imagination. And yet, that very same attention was dangerous. If Xerxes looked at you too long, the queen would notice. If he visited your chambers too often, the jealous whispers would grow louder. Women in the harem lived in constant fear of each other. They smiled at dinner, but underneath, the smiles were masks hiding envy, paranoia, and dread. It wasn't just about love either. It was about survival. The woman closest to Xerxes could sway decisions that touched the empire: which general would lead an army, which courtier would rise or fall, which city would be spared or destroyed. The harem wasn't a place of idle beauty, it was the heartbeat of politics, fueled by sexual rivalry. You can picture it. Women watching each other closely, every shift of the eye noticed, every rumor magnified. A gift of perfume could look like an attempt to seduce the king. A stolen glance across a banquet could spark rage hotter than fire. Even the servants, the slaves, the eunuchs who ran messages, played a part in this dangerous dance. They were the messengers of jealousy, carrying whispers like daggers between chambers. And in the middle of all this stood Amestris, the queen, the one woman no one dared provoke. She was Xerxes' wife, the official queen of Persia, and the mother of his children. But even she, especially she, felt the pressure. While she wore the crown, she also knew her throne wasn't safe from the curves and smiles of rivals. This was not a warm household. It was a cage of silk walls and golden locks, where women loved in secret and hated in silence. It was a world where desire wasn't private, it was dangerous. And soon, it would take only one forbidden glance, one reckless passion, to set the entire harem into flames of betrayal. If the harem was a world of jewels, secrets, and whispers, then Queen Amestris was its ruler and executioner. She wasn't just another wife of Xerxes, she was the wife. The Queen of Persia. The woman who sat beside the king on festivals, the mother of his children, the one destined to write her name into the empire's story. But here's what most people don't tell you. Amestris wasn't remembered for kindness. Ancient writers described her with one word over and over and over again. She wasn't beautiful in the way some concubines were said to be. She wasn't delicate or soft or eager to please. She was powerful. She was determined. And above all, she was jealous, so jealous that her rage would one day make even experienced warriors shudder. Picture the scene. Every time Xerxes glanced at another woman in his harem, Amestris felt like she was being betrayed. Every time she heard a whisper about his late-night visits to some hidden chamber, she burned inside, not quietly, not silently, but with fury that needed release. For Amestris, love wasn't tender. It was a battlefield. And in the Persian court, her battlefield was bloodied with rivalry. Amestris knew she had to hold on to Xerxes, not just because she loved him, but because her entire power, her future, her children's lives depended on it. If Xerxes replaced her with another favorite, Amestris would fall. And she would not fall quietly. The stories told about her paint her as a woman of violent extremes. When she loved, she gave everything. When she hated, there was no line she would not cross. You can imagine the fear in the harem whenever Amestris' face hardened, or her voice dropped, or her servants rushed quickly across the marble floors. Women knew exactly what that meant. The queen had noticed something. A rumor, a whisper, a glance that lingered too long. And once Amestris noticed you, escape was nearly impossible. Xerxes himself, the towering king of kings, didn't stand in her way. For all his soldiers and cities, even he often stepped back when his queen's jealousy caught fire. He may have been king of Persia, but inside his chambers, he knew how deadly Amestris' wrath could become. And soon, his wandering eyes would land on someone he could never resist, someone who would drive Amestris beyond the breaking point. This was not just marriage. This was war. For all his wealth, all his armies, all his unmatched power, King Xerxes still had one very human weakness: desire. He could command bridges to be built across seas, order empires to crumble, and bend nations to his will. But his eyes, his heart, those were not so easily controlled. And one woman, in particular, caught his gaze in a way that would haunt him forever. It wasn't a concubine from some faraway land. It wasn't a young maiden given as a gift from a defeated city. It was far more dangerous than that. It was his own brother's wife. Her name is lost in many records, but her beauty was described as dazzling, her presence unforgettable. She wasn't just any woman in the harem, she was family. To desire her wasn't just a betrayal of his queen. It was a betrayal of blood. And yet, Xerxes was powerless against the pull. Imagine the tension. A stolen glance across a banquet table, the heated silence when their eyes met, the dangerous electricity that everyone else tried to pretend they didn't notice. Xerxes wanted her, And in the palace, the king's desire was like a fire. Once it spread, it was impossible to hide. But what does that mean when you're married to Amestris? Because if there's one thing we already know about the queen, it's this: she tolerated nothing, not rivals, not affairs, not stolen glances. And now her husband, the most powerful man in the empire, was breaking the greatest taboo of all. So how long do you think it stayed a secret? Not long. The whispering started in the halls. The eunuchs who served the chambers noticed visits that didn't belong. Servants shifted uncomfortably as they carried trays through the corridors late at night. The women in the harem murmured in tones of shock and suppressed laughter, all knowing exactly what was happening. The king had fallen in love, or at least in lust, with his own brother's wife. And Amestris? She felt the betrayal burning inside her like hot iron. Every stolen kiss, every whispered word, every moment her husband was missing from her bed, it all stoked the fire of her fury. You can already see where this is going, can't you? In an empire dripping with luxury and gold, surrounded by endless armies and nations paying him tribute, Xerxes thought he was untouchable. But he was wrong. Because in his own palace, in his own home, he had lit a fuse. And when Amestris finally made her move, everyone would see just how terrifying a jealous queen of Persia could be. In ancient Persia, there was one day in a year when even the king himself couldn't say no. That day was the king's birthday. Now usually, Xerxes was the one giving orders, grand, impossible, terrifying orders. But on his birthday, the custom flipped. It was the one moment in the year when Xerxes had to grant a single request, no matter what it was. A law older than his father, older than his grandfather, bound him to it. Whatever someone asked for on that day, Xerxes had to give. It sounds charming, right? Like a royal birthday wish. But when you live in a court where sexual rivalry and jealous hatred run hotter than the desert sun, this birthday custom was not charming at all. It was terrifying. Because whoever dared to ask for something could claim a prize or a victim. And now, in the palace of Xerxes, Amestris was waiting. The banquet was prepared with all the glory you can imagine. Golden cups, silver plates, and roasted meats lined the long tables. Musicians played soft notes in the background. Servants bowed low, their eyes lowered, too frightened even to look up. The invited guests sat nervously, knowing they were witnessing one of the most dangerous festivals in the empire. Amestris, the queen, dressed herself in all the splendor she could muster. She wore a crown heavy with jewels, her robe stitched with golden thread. Even without speaking, her presence filled the room. Everyone who looked at her knew she had not come merely to celebrate her husband's birthday. She had come hunting. Xerxes, already flushed with wine, sat proudly at the head of the table. He smiled, he laughed, he raised his cup. But in the shadow of his wife's glare, his laughter sounded hollow. Amestris had been waiting for this day, waiting for the law that would trap him into obedience. And then it happened. When the music paused, Amestris rose from her seat. All eyes turned toward her. Her tone was smooth, but her words cut sharper than the sharpest dagger. "Great king, on your birthday, I have a request. Give me the robe." Everyone froze. Not just any robe. This was the robe Xerxes had once given as a gift of honor to the very woman who had consumed his desires, his brother's wife. The silk, the embroidery, the scent of that garment were tied to nights of passion, to glances and whispers that everyone pretended not to notice. By asking for it, Amestris wasn't just demanding fabric. She was tearing the secret wide open, stripping away all the glamour of the affair and making it public. You could feel the silence in that room. Even the servants were afraid to breathe. Xerxes shifted uneasily. He knew the law. He couldn't refuse. His heart pounded, but his pride left him no escape. And so, with a trembling hand, he gave the command. The robe was fetched. As Amestris took it in her hands, the court understood exactly what it meant. This was no gift. This was a weapon. A humiliation disguised as embroidery. A queen's silent promise that betrayal would be answered in blood. And from that moment forward, no one doubted. Amestris was ready to strike back. The birthday celebration, meant for joy, had become a prelude to horror. The robe had changed hands. A garment of silk and gold, beautiful to the eyes, but heavy with scandal. Everyone in the hall understood what this meant. Amestris had spoken without saying it aloud. I know. I see what you've done. And you will all witness the price. That robe wasn't just cloth. It was evidence. It was humiliation dressed up as embroidery. And soon, it became the spark for one of the most horrifying acts of vengeance ever whispered about in the Persian court. At the festival, Amestris wore the robe proudly, like armor. To the guests, her face was an icy mask of triumph. But inside, her heart burned with jealousy so hot it demanded blood. She had her proof. Now she wanted punishment. It began with whispers. Amestris approached her guards in secret, giving orders in a low voice that made even the toughest men pale. She demanded that her rival, the woman who had shared Xerxes' desire, his brother's wife, be seized. Amestris would not forgive her beauty. She would not forgive her charm. And she would certainly not forgive that she had tempted the King of Kings. When the woman was dragged into her chambers, there was no golden feast, no music, no laughter. There was only horror. Ancient writers recorded, in grim detail, the queen's cruelty. Amestris ordered her body mutilated in vengeance. For every smile Xerxes had stolen, for every night she imagined them together, Amestris returned pain. Piece by piece, blow by blow. The courtiers who later whispered about the event could barely bring themselves to speak it. Men who had faced death in battle admitted that Amestris' rage was worse than any army. The truth spread through the palace like smoke. The queen's jealousy was deadly. And what of Xerxes? The great king? He sat in silence, perhaps ashamed, perhaps afraid, perhaps so bound by tradition that he dared not challenge his own wife's power inside the harem. Some say he looked away. Others claim he knew about it, but chose not to stop her. Whatever the truth, Xerxes allowed Amestris' horror to unfold. The message was clear. To cross Amestris was to guarantee suffering. To steal her husband's gaze was to sign your own death warrant. Even the women closest to her began to tremble when she entered a room. No glance at Xerxes was safe. No smile toward him was without risk. In a palace built on wealth and gold, Amestris had created a reign made of fear. The robe, once meant as a symbol of love, was now remembered as a blood-soaked flag of warning. For Amestris, the betrayal had been answered. But for the women of the harem, life became more dangerous than ever. Because if the queen struck down the wife of a royal prince, who was safe after that? From then onward, the palace was not only a place of silks and jewels. It was a cage where every woman moved carefully, every glance measured, every whisper feared. After Amestris' vengeance, the harem lived in shadow. Once the bloody punishment of Xerxes' brother's wife was complete, the palace should have returned to peace. At least that's what ordinary people might have hoped for. A single act of vengeance, however cruel, could have satisfied Amestris' rage. But those who knew her understood. She was not the kind of woman to forgive and forget. She was the kind of woman to remember forever. From that day onward, the harem lived under a cloud of fear. It was no longer just the whispers of jealousy that unsettled the women. It was the cold, sharp memory of what Amestris had already done. Everyone had seen how far she was willing to go. Her rivals looked at her, and they didn't see a queen wrapped in jewels. They saw executioners' hands hidden beneath silken sleeves. Amestris' wrath was not like a quick fire that burns bright and fades. It was more like hot coals, glowing and smoldering, ready to reignite at the slightest spark. Every rumor of another woman catching Xerxes' eye was enough to stir her fury. And Amestris didn't need much proof. A whisper, a glance, a guard's careless comment. That alone could drive her to action. The records tell us of other horrifying acts that built her reputation. Amestris would order punishments that shocked even the people of the Persian court, who were used to harshness and intrigue. She mutilated women who angered her or competed for Xerxes' affection. She stripped rivals not only of their beauty but of their very dignity. And the message was always the same: no one outshines the queen. What made her more terrifying was how calmly she carried out this hatred. She did not scream in public, or beg, or curse loudly. Her vengeance was cold, deliberate, and carefully planned. By the time her anger became visible, it was already too late for her victim. Now you might be wondering, where was Xerxes in all this? After all, he was the most powerful ruler in the world at the time. The king of kings, sitting on a throne taller and richer than that of any rival. Why didn't he stop her? Why didn't he step in when his queen turned the harem into a prison of fear? The truth is, Xerxes let her do it. Some believe he was too ashamed after his betrayal to defy her. Others claimed he feared Amestris almost as much as the women did. And still others thought Xerxes simply couldn't be bothered. The Greek historians who tell us these stories love to paint him as weak, distracted, and even cowardly, a man who had conquered kingdoms but surrendered inside his own household. Whatever the reason, the silence of Xerxes only magnified Amestris' freedom to act as she pleased. And so, Amestris' reputation outlived even her beauty. In whispers that drifted through the corridors, her name was spoken with dread. Children of servants were warned against crossing her servants. Courtiers made sure to avoid her path. Generals who commanded thousands in war bowed their heads nervously when she looked their way. For Amestris, fear was power. And she wielded it well. Her wrath was not only personal, it became political. The empire itself grew used to the idea that the queen's jealousy could ruin lives, shape decisions, and even alter the balance of power. Amestris was no ordinary queen. She was a storm made flesh, and her thunder rolled far past the palace gates. While Amestris ruled like a storm over the harem, not every woman inside those golden walls wore a crown or carried the title of queen. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, were concubines, beautiful young women from every corner of the Persian Empire. Some were captured in war. Others were gifted by foreign rulers. A few were chosen for their beauty or their wit and brought into the palace as prizes for the king. To outsiders, they seemed like the luckiest women in the world. To those living inside, it was a dangerous game of survival. Imagine being one of them. Perhaps you were once a respected noblewoman in Babylon, or the daughter of a proud warrior in Egypt, or maybe just a village girl chosen for your beauty. Suddenly, you've been lifted out of your old life and placed in the most powerful man's palace on earth. At first, it could feel like a dream: silk clothes, endless jewels, sweet perfumes, food and wine you'd never seen before. But behind it all lurked the same question every woman asked herself: will the king notice me? Because Xerxes' glance was the closest thing these women had to safety. If he favored you, you could rise in power. Servants would bow to you, guards would protect you. Drivers would whisk you away in golden chariots. But if he ignored you, or worse, if Amestris realized you caught his interest, you could fall faster than you ever rose. The concubines learned quickly that their competition wasn't just for the king's heart, it was for their lives. Every flirtatious smile, every hand that brushed against Xerxes at a banquet, every moment in which his eyes lingered too long came with a risk. The queen noticed. The queen always noticed. So what did these women do? They adapted. Some played innocent and tried to stay invisible, hiding in the shadows, whispering prayers that neither the king nor the queen would remember their face. Others leaned into the game, trying to outshine rivals with charm, beauty, or clever words. It was a world of constant pretending, women smiling at one another across the fountain pool by day, then whispering venom to eunuchs by night. The eunuchs, those watchful figures who served as the hands and eyes of the harem, became messengers of jealousy. Their words could lift up one concubine and ruin the other. They carried stories down narrow corridors, sometimes exaggerating, sometimes inventing, always changing the balance of power with a few spoken words. In many cases, it was eunuch gossip that landed a woman in Amestris' crosshairs. And when Amestris struck, the whole harem trembled. The concubines never knew if today's laughter would turn into tomorrow's screams. Even if you were a favorite of the king, you weren't untouchable. If Amestris saw you as a threat, it didn't matter how much Xerxes loved the look of your eyes or the softness of your voice. You were already living on borrowed time. But here's what makes it worse. The women couldn't simply leave. Once brought into the harem, it was a prison wrapped in velvet. The doors were guarded, the walls high. For many concubines, the palace was both their cage and their coffin. So they lived each day with a strange mix of pleasure and dread, soaking in luxury by day, and trembling under candlelight at night. In this way, even women without crowns played their part in Persia's sexual rivalries. Their fears, their ambitions, their desperate hopes all mingled into the hot, suffocating air of Xerxes' palace. And as every concubine knew, a single jealous glance or careless word could summon the wrath of Amestris, the queen who haunted their every step. Up until now, you might be wondering, why does any of this matter? Why should we care about the jealous rage of a queen or the trembling of concubines behind golden doors? Surely the Persian Empire was too large, too mighty, too disciplined to be swayed by squabbles in a bedroom. Right? Wrong. In ancient Persia, the harem wasn't just a private place for relaxation. It was the nerve center of the empire's power. What happened behind those silken curtains echoed across nations. Decisions made in whispers on satin cushions could topple generals, ruin governors, and even change the fate of wars. Here's why. First, the queen herself wasn't just a wife. Amestris came from a powerful Persian family, and her position meant influence. She had allies among nobles, family ties to the most elite clans, and connections that stretched far across the empire. Every decision she made rippled outward. If she loved you, she could lift your career into the heavens. If she hated you, like she hated her rivals in the harem, you vanished. Second, concubines were not powerless ornaments. The women closest to Xerxes were often his most trusted advisors in moments of vulnerability. Think about it. A general might see Xerxes during a war council. A noble might kneel before him during ceremonies, but a concubine saw him after the wine was drunk, after the speeches ended, after the crown was laid aside. In the intimacy of night, a single whisper into the king's ear could nudge him toward mercy or vengeance. There are stories from Greek historians like Herodotus and Ctesias that the Persian kings trusted women of the harem far more than their ministers or counselors. These weren't dusty scholars reading by candlelight. They were women using charm, affection, and desire to pull strings on the empire's greatest leader. And when those women were locked in jealous rivalries with one another, each one trying to cut down the other, the king was caught in the middle, not just as a husband, but as a ruler. Now imagine what that means for an empire as large as Persia. A decision made in anger after a quarrel could mean raising an army to punish a rebellious province. A night of love could mean promoting an undeserving noble. A queen's rage could exile a family, slaughter rivals, or shift loyalty between sons who might someday wear the crown. Sexual rivalry inside the harem wasn't separate from politics, it was politics. And this wasn't unique to Persia. Across history, from China's Forbidden City to the Ottoman Empire centuries later, harems became breeding grounds of influence, where women no one outside ever saw shape the destiny of millions. But in Xerxes' time, it was especially explosive because his personality was so human. He wasn't the cold, disciplined type. He was passionate, emotional, easily swayed by desire. And this made him vulnerable to the women closest to him, and vulnerable to the cruel storms that Amestris unleashed. So why does it matter? Because when Persian soldiers marched to war, when new laws were announced, or when distant cities were crushed or rewarded, often the seeds of those decisions did not begin in the majestic throne room or the war councils. They began in the private chambers, in jealous glances, in whispers carried by eunuchs, and in the rage of Amestris. The Persian Empire, at its height, stretched from Egypt to India. It ruled lands, cultures, and people so diverse that even modern nations pale in comparison. And yet even an empire that massive could be shaken by something as small, as intimate, as personal as who caught the king's attention late at night. That is why the story of Xerxes' wives is not just gossip from the past. It's a lesson in how even the greatest powers can crumble, not from outside armies, but from the storms that rage within their own walls. And when those storms are filled with jealousy, lust, and unrelenting anger, the damage isn't just personal. It's political, global, and permanent. When people think of King Xerxes, they imagine a man of endless power, the towering ruler who ordered bridges built across seas, who whipped the waters of the Hellespont in rage, who commanded the wealth of half the known world. In front of his generals and soldiers, he was the king of kings, a figure larger than life. Yet within the private walls of his palace, surrounded by women whose smiles hid daggers, Xerxes was not a god. He was a man vulnerable, distracted, and weighed down by the storm he couldn't control. The truth was simple. Xerxes had conquered cities, but could not conquer his own desires. His gaze wandered too easily, and his weakness for beauty exposed him to dangers no army could protect him from. For every concubine he favored, there was another woman plotting jealousy. For every queenly glance, there was a rival watching in silence. And above them all was Amestris, his wife, his queen, his judge. She was a constant shadow in his life, and not the kind that offered comfort. When he smiled at other women, he knew eyes were on him. When he laughed too easily with a concubine, he anticipated the cold silence of his wife later that night. Even in triumph, he lived uneasily, like a soldier expecting an ambush at any moment. Xerxes' weakness was not just emotional, it was political. His generals and advisors could sense when the king was distracted. He might appear in public draped in royal robes, but behind closed doors he faced the scorn of Amestris' icy words. At the same time, he feared the influence other women could have over him. A concubine's whisper could tilt a decision. A queen's suspicion could destroy a family. This was the double bind of Xerxes' reign. His own household became a battlefield, one where he could never claim victory. It wasn't just Amestris who haunted him. The women of the harem watched and waited, feeding rumors like dry twigs into a fire, knowing those stories would burn in the queen's fury and eventually reach Xerxes' ears. Eunuchs who carried messages and gossip stoked his paranoia. Every night, when the palace quieted under starlight, Xerxes was left with the endless thought, whom can I trust? A man can raise armies, but he cannot sleep soundly if his own home is an enemy camp. Imagine the great king lying awake while armies marched under his banners, unable to rest because of whispers echoing in his mind, jealous wives, ambitious concubines, the shadow of Amestris advancing relentlessly through it all. And so the legend of Xerxes is twofold. History remembers him as a conqueror, a man who shook the world when he marched into Greece. But inside the palace, he was another kind of prisoner caught in the silken cage of his wives, bound not by chains, but by jealousy, lust, and fear. Even the greatest power in the world is useless if you cannot control the shadows in your own home. That was the lesson of Xerxes, a man who could crush nations, but who slowly, steadily, was undone by rivalries tangled in the very chambers he called his own. Empires rarely fall all at once. From the outside, they look unshakable, towering like mountains, glittering with power and wealth. But inside, deep in their roots, small cracks start forming. Bit by bit, those cracks spread until the whole mountain comes tumbling down. Such was the shadow that haunted not just King Xerxes, but the very lifeblood of the Persian Empire. What do we remember Xerxes for today? His war at Thermopylae? His massive army of 1,000,000 men? His bridges across seas and palaces glittering with treasure? Certainly, those images are carved into history. But look closer, and another story surfaces, not of armies or walls, but of silks, whispers, and jealous glances. For in his palace at Susa, Xerxes discovered a truth that remains timeless. The greatest weakness of a king may not be the spears of his enemies, but the rivalries of his wives and lovers. When Amestris tore apart the rival who had caught Xerxes' eye, she did more than silence a woman. She silenced trust in the palace. From that moment forward, the harem was no longer simply a sanctuary of wives, it was a chamber of terror. No concubine dared laugh too freely or step too close to the king. No noblewoman's daughter felt safe. It was as though an invisible blade hung over everyone. Even Xerxes himself went to bed, knowing that desire could mean disaster and that love could lead to ruin. That kind of fear weakens even the strongest throne. It gnaws at the private heart of power until decisions are no longer made out of wisdom, but out of secrecy, suspicion, and shame. How can a king lead an empire when his own home feels trapped in chains? The Greeks, who loved to mock their Persian enemies, couldn't resist telling these tales. To them, Xerxes wasn't just a vain, failed conqueror. They painted him as a man consumed by lust, outwitted and overshadowed by the furies in his household. To the Greeks, it was proof their enemies were softer, weaker, undone not just by Greek swords, but by their own bedsheets. Perhaps they exaggerated, perhaps they twisted the stories. Yet the fact that these tales endured says something powerful. People always understood that what happens behind closed doors often shapes the fate of kingdoms. And so Amestris, remembered with fear and horror, leaves us with an unsettling reflection. She was no mere accessory to her husband's power. She was, in her own way, the darker twin of Xerxes' empire, a woman whose jealousies and cruelties became part of his legacy. The lesson? Armies, walls, and treasures matter little if the throne itself is corroded by storm. For Xerxes, the true battlefield wasn't in Greece or Babylon. It was the palace in Persepolis, the bedrooms in Susa, the rivalries in his harem. And on that battlefield, he could never truly win. So when we speak of Xerxes, the king of kings, let us remember not only bridges destroyed by storms or armies defeated at sea. Let us also remember the invisible storm within his palace, a storm called jealousy, which left the mightiest man of his age surrounded by shadows. Because sometimes, history's greatest empires don't fall to swords at all. They fall to desire. They fall to fear. They fall to the battles no one outside the palace ever saw.